Hi guys, Nick here from Intuitive Tennis. What is the wrist lag? And is the wrist lag something that you have to master to have a good forehand? Check out today's video and find out. What is the wrist lag? Well, it's basically the wrist in an extended position lagging behind the arm. And this happens on every forehand, a classic forehand or a modern forehand. So let's start off with the classic forehand. These players, even back in the wooden racket era, still had wrist lag on their forehands. This is not a modern characteristic of the forehand. So basically they would take the racket straight back, and when they started the forward phase of the swing, the racket would lag behind like this. The same way it lags on the modern forehand. On the modern forehand, we have to differentiate between the ATP forehand and the WTA forehand, and both of these forehands have wrist lag. So on the WTA forehands, a common way to take the racket back is behind the body like this. And so we get pretty much an immediate wrist lag once the racket drops here. And now as the player comes around, the wrist is lagging behind the arm in the forward phase of the swing, like this. On an ATP forehand, what most players will do is they will close the racket here, and now it's going to be a slight delayed wrist lag. So as they initiate the forward phase of the swing, the wrist will then lag behind like this. The modern forehand has a lot more rotation and power compared to the classic forehand, and what the wrist lag on the modern forehand would actually look like is that the tip of the racket will actually point backwards like this as the wrist lags back. So it will not go straight back like this as it did on the classic forehand. The wrist will actually, as the racket drops, it will actually go a little bit further behind the body like this. And this is true for all high-level players. The wrist lag is very pronounced on the ATP style forehand that has a closing of the racket face on the outside of the body, on the hitting side of the body. And so what will happen on the hitting side of the body is, let's take Federer for example, the strings will close here, and then as Federer initiates the forward phase of the swings, the racket will not stay like this as he goes forward. It would actually flip in a straight position. So it will go from here into a wrist lag like this. And this is not something that you need to worry about. This will happen naturally because we intuitively know that we're not going to be able to make contact if we go towards the ball with the closed strings like this. So we naturally are going to always open up the racket face as we initiate the forward phase of the swing. How do we make this wrist lag happen? Well, it's something that you don't have to make happen. It's going to happen on its own. If you make all the proper steps on the forehand, you will achieve this wrist lag intuitively, and you will not be aware that it's taking place. And one way I can prove to you that this is true is if you try to perform a shadow swing. You will not be able to make the wrist lag the same way you do it when you do a normal forehand. And what will happen is, if you do a shadow swing, you will not be able to do this here because you're completely unaware that it's taking place when you hit your forehand in a live ball situation. So on a shadow forehand, you will basically take your racket like this, and then you will start coming forward without the wrist lagging behind as much as it would on a normal forehand. So it's absolutely impossible to recreate this wrist lag because we perform it without being aware that it's taking place. Is it possible to have a forehand without a wrist lag? Yes, it is. And it only happens in a forehand that's hit in a completely sideways position through the entirety of the shot. So if you take a look at my forehand here, if I stay sideways and I can keep my wrist pretty straight this way, and now as I go forward into the contact and I stay sideways, I can maintain this straight wrist throughout the entire stroke. So the wrist is not lagging behind as much as it would on a rotational forehand. And so if I start rotating, the wrist will lag behind a lot further. You can see there's a bigger L shape in my wrist. And if I don't rotate, if I stay sideways, you can see that the wrist position is straight through the entirety of the stroke. So with rotation, the wrist lag will happen naturally. Is the wrist lag something that you should practice? Absolutely not. And in fact, if you do practice the wrist lag, you might make your forehand worse. The most crucial part of the stroke is the acceleration phase. This is where you want to gain your maximum acceleration. And the only way you can mechanically make this wrist lag happen at a conscious level is by slowing the stroke down. And what ends up happening a lot of times for players that do think about the wrist lag, they will slow down the stroke right here to make this happen, and they end up having a hitch in their swing. You should definitely never ever concern yourself with the wrist lag. If you do all the components of the forehand correctly, this wrist lag will happen intuitively. Thank you guys for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.